My friends, I want to tell you about a phone call I ended abruptly in my late 60s, mid-sentence, without explanation, apology, or any of the careful diplomatic softening I had spent an entire lifetime believing was required of a decent, reasonable person. My younger brother, a man who had spent decades testing the limits of my patience with cutting remarks disguised as jokes, had just made a particularly cruel comment about my late wife during what was supposed to be an ordinary catch-up call. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the old, practiced instinct to laugh it off, to smooth things over, to protect the peace at my own expense exactly as I had done for nearly 50 years of our relationship. And then, for reasons I still cannot fully explain even now, I simply said, "I won't be spoken to that way," and hung up the phone. I want to be honest with you that I sat in my kitchen afterward with my heart pounding, genuinely uncertain whether I had just done something wise or something I would deeply regret. I had spent decades absorbing exactly this kind of behavior from my brother, always responding with a nervous laugh, a gentle deflection, occasionally a mild, easily dismissed protest that changed nothing about how he continued to treat me. This was the first time in our entire adult relationship that I had ended an interaction on the spot, without negotiation, without explanation, without waiting to see whether he would apologize before I decided how to feel about it. What happened next taught me something I wish I had understood 5 decades earlier. My brother called back within the hour, his voice noticeably different, carefully apologetic in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. And in the years since that single phone call, a call that lasted perhaps 4 seconds from my final words to the click of the receiver, he has never again spoken to me in that particular cutting tone, not once. I did not achieve this shift through years of patient explanation, through carefully worded confrontations, through appeals to his better nature or reminders of how his words affected me. I achieved it through a single, immediate, unexplained consequence, delivered calmly and without negotiation, that fundamentally recalibrated how he understood the relationship between his behavior and my continued availability. Today I want to share with you everything I have come to understand about this particular kind of decisive action, why it works so consistently and so much more effectively than the years of patient explanation and gentle boundary setting most of us attempt first, and the many different situations across my own life and the lives of people close to me where this same single principle has produced remarkably similar, lasting results. This is not a lesson about becoming harsh, cold, or vindictive toward the people in your life. It is a lesson about a very specific kind of clarity that toxic behavior patterns respond to far more reliably than any amount of patient, well-intentioned explanation ever manages to achieve. The single insight underlying everything I am about to share is this: toxic behavior does not stop because you explain, plead, or gently request that it stop. It stops the moment an immediate, unexplained, and genuinely enforced consequence makes continuing that behavior more costly than it is worth. For most of my life, I believed that patient explanation, delivered calmly and repeatedly, would eventually reach even the most difficult people in my life, that enough well-reasoned appeals to fairness and kindness would gradually reshape their behavior over time. I finally understood, in my late 60s, that this patient explanation approach very often accomplishes almost nothing with genuinely toxic behavior patterns, because it continues to reward the behavior with your continued engagement and availability, regardless of how clearly or reasonably you have articulated your objection to it. Everything that follows is simply this one insight, appearing across the many different relationships and situations where it eventually proved itself true in my own life. The first place this insight proved itself was with my brother, exactly as I have already described, where 50 years of gentle explanation accomplished nothing, and a single unexplained, immediate consequence accomplished a permanent change within a single hour. I want to emphasize how genuinely stunned I was by the speed and completeness of this shift, given how thoroughly my decades of gentle approaches had failed to produce even the smallest, most temporary improvement in his behavior toward me. The second place this insight proved itself was with a longtime friend who had developed a habit of cancelling plans at the last possible moment, repeatedly, over the course of several years, always with an elaborate excuse that I had always accepted graciously. After the 5th or 6th such cancellation in a single year, I simply stopped making future plans with her at all, offering no explanation when she next reached out to suggest something new, and no lengthy justification when she eventually asked directly why I seemed to have pulled back. I said simply, "Our plans together haven't been working out lately," and left it there. She began, remarkably, proposing plans with considerably more reliability and follow-through in the months that followed, plans she then consistently honored in a way she never previously had. The third place this insight proved itself was with an adult daughter who had developed a pattern of speaking to me dismissively whenever I offered even the gentlest observation about her own children's behavior. After years of patiently explaining that I only wanted to help, explanations that changed nothing about her dismissive tone, I simply stopped offering any observations whatsoever, informing her plainly, once, that I would keep my thoughts to myself going forward given how these conversations had typically unfolded between us. Her tone toward me on other subjects improved considerably in the following months, and she eventually began asking my opinion directly on parenting matters, an invitation she extended entirely on her own initiative once my withdrawal had made clear that our previous dynamic was no longer available to her by default. The fourth place this insight proved itself was with a former business partner who had developed a habit of taking credit for shared work whenever it suited him, a pattern I had addressed repeatedly through calm, reasonable conversation that changed nothing about his subsequent behavior. After one particularly blatant instance, I simply and calmly corrected the record in front of the exact audience where he had made the false claim, offering no lengthy explanation or apology for the correction itself. He never again attempted to take credit for shared work in my presence, a shift that occurred immediately and permanently following this single, public, unexplained correction. The fifth place this insight proved itself was with an in-law who had developed a habit of making pointed comments about my finances during family gatherings, comments I had always deflected with an uncomfortable laugh in earlier years. After years of this pattern continuing unaddressed by my gentle deflections, I finally responded to one such comment by simply stating, without any explanation or elaboration, "We don't discuss finances," and immediately changing the subject myself before she had any opportunity to respond or negotiate further. She never raised the subject again in my presence, in what became an immediate and complete cessation of a pattern that years of uncomfortable laughter had never once managed to discourage. The sixth place this insight proved itself was with a neighbor who had developed a habit of parking his vehicle partially blocking my own driveway, a pattern he continued despite several polite, friendly conversations I had initiated over many months asking him to be more careful. After these repeated polite requests accomplished nothing, I simply had his vehicle towed on the next occasion it blocked my driveway, without any advance warning or further conversation. He never blocked my driveway again, a permanent and immediate change that months of polite, patient requests had entirely failed to produce. The seventh place this insight proved itself was with a sibling-in-law who habitually arrived hours late to family gatherings I hosted, disrupting carefully planned meals for the entire extended family without any apparent concern for the inconvenience this caused everyone else. After years of gentle reminders about starting times that changed nothing about her habitual lateness, I simply began serving the meal at the announced time regardless of who had or had not yet arrived, offering no delay and no explanation when she eventually arrived to find the meal already well underway. She began arriving considerably closer to the announced time at every subsequent gathering, a shift that occurred immediately following this single, unexplained departure from my previous pattern of accommodating her lateness. The eighth place this insight proved itself was with an old friend who consistently dominated every conversation between us with lengthy monologues about her own life, rarely if ever asking a single question about mine, a pattern I had gently mentioned to her on several occasions without any resulting change in her behavior. After one particularly one-sided conversation, I simply ended the call considerably earlier than usual, offering a brief, genuine excuse about needing to attend to something else, without any further explanation of my actual reasons for cutting the conversation short. Our subsequent calls became noticeably more balanced, with her asking about my own life considerably more frequently than she ever had during the years when I had only gently mentioned the imbalance without ever actually changing my own behavior in response to it. The ninth place this insight proved itself was with an adult son who had developed a habit of requesting financial assistance with increasing frequency, assistance I had always provided despite gentle conversations about the pattern that never changed his subsequent requests. After one particularly casual request, delivered as though it were an unremarkable formality rather than a genuine ask, I simply declined without any lengthy explanation, stating only that I would not be able to help with this particular request. He did not ask again for well over a year, and when he eventually did make another request, it arrived with a level of genuine consideration and gratitude that his earlier, more casual requests had never once carried. The 10th place this insight proved itself was with a close friend who habitually made subtle, cutting remarks about my appearance disguised as concerned observations about my health, remarks I had always absorbed with a nervous laugh and quiet private hurt. After one such remark at a public gathering, I simply said, calmly and without elaboration, "I'd rather you didn't comment on my appearance," and immediately moved the conversation elsewhere myself. She never made another comment of this kind again, a permanent change that years of my own quiet, absorbed hurt had never once produced on its own. The 11th place this insight proved itself was with a former colleague who had developed a habit of forwarding me unsolicited work requests well outside our professional relationship, requests I had always fulfilled out of a habitual, unexamined obligation despite the genuine inconvenience they caused me. After one particularly demanding request, I simply did not respond at all, allowing the request to go entirely unanswered rather than my usual pattern of eventually, reluctantly fulfilling it. He never sent another such request, a permanent cessation that occurred immediately following this single, silent non-response, without any explanation on my part ever being required or offered. The 12th place this insight proved itself was with a sister who habitually shared private family information with extended relatives despite my repeated requests, delivered gently and patiently over several years, that certain matters remained private within our immediate family. After discovering yet another breach of this request, I simply stopped sharing any private information with her whatsoever going forward, informing her plainly, once, that I would keep such matters to myself from that point on, given the pattern that had repeatedly continued. Her own discretion with information I did eventually choose to share again, months later, improved considerably, apparently motivated by a genuine desire to restore the fuller trust she had lost through her own repeated breaches. The 13th place this insight proved itself was with an adult grandchild who had developed a habit of speaking to me with considerable disrespect whenever I gently corrected some minor behavior during visits, disrespect that years of patient explanation about appropriate tone had never once improved. After one particularly disrespectful response, I simply ended the visit early, calling his parents to arrange an earlier pickup than planned, without any lengthy lecture or explanation offered to the grandchild himself in the moment. His tone toward me during subsequent visits improved dramatically and immediately, a shift that years of patient conversation about appropriate respect had never once managed to produce on its own. The 14th place this insight proved itself was with a long-time book club acquaintance who habitually interrupted and dismissed my contributions during group discussions, a pattern several gentle, private conversations with her directly had never once improved. After one particularly dismissive interruption during a group meeting, I simply stopped attending the book club entirely, without any explanation offered to the group or to her individually. Several other members eventually reached out privately to check on my absence, and upon learning the reason, addressed the matter directly with her themselves, resulting in a genuine, lasting change in how she treated other members' contributions during subsequent meetings, a change that my own years of private, gentle conversation with her alone had never once achieved. The 15th thing I understood, considering all of these examples together honestly, was that in every single instance, the shift occurred immediately following the unexplained consequence itself, not following any subsequent conversation or explanation offered afterward. I noticed a strong temptation, in nearly every one of these situations, to eventually explain my reasoning more fully once some time had passed, believing this explanation would help the other person understand and further reinforce the change in their behavior. I discovered, almost without exception, that offering this additional explanation after the fact accomplished nothing beyond what the original, unexplained consequence had already achieved on its own, and in several cases actually reopened a negotiation that the silent consequence itself had already successfully closed. The 16th thing I understood was that the consequence itself needed to be genuinely enforced, not merely threatened, in order to produce this lasting effect, and that my own history of empty threats had likely contributed considerably to why gentle approaches had failed for so many years beforehand. I recognized, looking back honestly across my own life, that I had occasionally warned certain difficult people in my life that I would eventually stop tolerating a given behavior, warnings I had never actually followed through on when the behavior inevitably continued. This history of empty threats, I came to understand, had likely taught these particular people that my stated boundaries carried no genuine weight, making the eventual real consequence considerably more surprising and effective precisely because it broke from this established pattern of unenforced warnings. The 17th thing I understood was that the calm, unemotional delivery of these consequences mattered nearly as much as the consequences themselves, since a consequence delivered in visible anger or distress was often received by the other person as an emotional outburst to be weathered rather than a genuine, considered recalibration of the relationship's terms. I noticed, in the instances where I managed to deliver my response with genuine calm rather than visible frustration, that the other person seemed to take the change considerably more seriously than in situations where my own emotional agitation was evident, as though the calm itself communicated a settled certainty that raw anger, however justified, simply could not convey nearly as effectively. The 18th thing I understood was that this approach required a genuine willingness to accept whatever outcome followed, including the possibility that the relationship itself might not survive the consequence, rather than secretly hoping the action would simply function as a more forceful version of the explanation I had already tried unsuccessfully many times before. I recognized that in every instance where this approach genuinely worked, I had arrived at the moment of action having already made peace with the possibility that the relationship might end entirely as a result, rather than deploying the consequence as a manipulative tactic while secretly expecting and requiring a particular reconciliatory response from the other person. The 19th thing I understood was that this principle applied just as clearly to strangers and casual acquaintances as it did to close family members, though the specific relationships I have shared with you today happen to involve people closest to me. A brief but telling example arose with a contractor who had repeatedly rescheduled work on my home at the last minute, a pattern that several polite conversations had never once improved, until I finally cancelled the contract entirely and hired someone else without further discussion, after which he called immediately, offering considerably more reliable scheduling in an unsuccessful attempt to win back my business, a response his earlier reassurances during our polite conversations had never once produced. And the 20th and final form this single insight takes, the one that ties every other form together, is simply this: toxic people are not testing whether you are right, they are testing what you will continue to tolerate, and the moment you demonstrate, through immediate action rather than explanation, exactly where that tolerance genuinely ends, the testing stops almost entirely, often permanently, and almost always far more quickly than years of patient, reasonable conversation ever could have achieved. For most of my life, I believed that toxic behavior persisted because the other person simply did not understand how their actions affected me, and that sufficient explanation would eventually correct this misunderstanding. I finally understood, across every single example I have shared with you today, that the behavior persisted not from misunderstanding, but from an accurate, ongoing assessment that continuing it carried no genuine cost, an assessment that only a real, immediate, unexplained consequence could ever meaningfully correct. My friends, I want to be honest with you that this approach initially felt, to me, considerably harsher and less kind than the patient, explanatory approach I had practiced for most of my life. I worried, in nearly every one of these instances, that I was behaving coldly, unreasonably, perhaps even cruelly by responding with silent action rather than the patient conversation I had always believed a good, decent person owed to the people in their life. What I discovered, across every single one of these experiences, was precisely the opposite. The patient, explanatory approach, repeated for years without producing any genuine change, was actually the less kind path, both to myself and, ultimately, to the other person, who remained permanently confused about where the genuine boundary of the relationship actually lay, continuing behavior that damaged the relationship indefinitely rather than receiving the clear, immediate information that alone allowed them to genuinely correct course. I think often of that 4-second phone call with my brother, and how strange it still feels, even now, that a single sentence and the click of a receiver accomplished what nearly 50 years of gentle explanation, hurt feelings, and patient hope had never once managed to achieve. I do not believe this is because my brother is a particularly unusual or difficult person. I believe, instead, that this pattern reflects something genuinely true about how most people, even those we love deeply, actually calibrate their own behavior, responding far more reliably to immediate, real consequence than to any amount of patient explanation, however reasonable and well-intentioned that explanation genuinely is. I want to share one further reflection before we close, something I have come to believe is essential for anyone considering putting this particular approach into practice in their own life. This is not a technique to be deployed casually, in response to every minor irritation or disagreement that arises in a relationship. I want to be clear that most ordinary friction between people who love each other is best resolved through exactly the patient conversation and generous accommodation I have practiced throughout most of my own life. What I am describing today applies specifically to genuinely toxic, repeated patterns that have already survived considerable patient explanation without any meaningful change, patterns where the evidence has already accumulated, across months or years, that gentle approaches simply are not working. Reserved for these particular situations, and only these, this decisive approach has proven, in my own experience, considerably more effective and, ultimately, considerably kinder than the alternative of continuing indefinitely down a path that had already demonstrated its own genuine futility. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, a relationship where years of patient explanation, gentle requests, and hopeful conversation have failed to produce any genuine, lasting change in someone's toxic behavior toward you, I want you to know that this pattern is not evidence that you have failed to explain yourself clearly enough, or that more patient conversation is simply required before the change will finally arrive. It is likely evidence that explanation itself was never the tool this particular situation required. What most genuinely toxic patterns respond to is not more words, however carefully chosen, but a single, calm, immediate action that finally demonstrates, rather than merely describes, exactly where your tolerance for this particular behavior genuinely ends. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize a relationship in your own life where this same principle might finally produce the change that years of patient explanation have not, and gives you the courage to respond, when the moment genuinely calls for it, with calm, immediate action rather than yet another round of careful, hopeful conversation. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Protect your own peace with clarity rather than endless explanation. And trust that the single decisive action you have been hesitant to take may accomplish, within a single afternoon, what years of patient hoping never could. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay calm, stay clear, and remember, toxic behavior rarely responds to your words nearly as reliably as it responds to your actions. Thank you for watching.